Thank you. In case you don't remember, my name is Chris Bergen. I'm with Tax Analysts. And I just have to say, this is the nicest school cafeteria I've ever been in. Looks nothing like anything I've experienced. It's a great kick for me to introduce to you David Cay Johnston. He's a friend of Tax Analysts. I'm proud to say he's a friend of mine. We've been together for a long time. Now, I could take a long time and describe all of David's accomplishments, but we've edited it down to a reasonable statement so I can get out of the way and let him start. David won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for his coverage of taxes for the New York Times. He teaches the tax, property, and business law of the ancient world at Syracuse University College of Law. David is the president of the 4,200-member journalist organization Investigative Reporters and Editors. David, by the way, is one of the best investigative reporters that was ever born. He wrote the bestsellers Perfectly Legal and Free Lunch, which I believe I have both signed copies of. And this fall, his latest book, The Fine Print, his third book in his series on hidden aspects of the American economy, which exposes changes in laws and regulations in the mainstream news media that the mainstream news media ignored, that thwarted competition, inflated prices, and took away consumer rights and safety protections. He also writes and blogs for Tax Analysts. So on behalf of Tax Analysts, let me say, hang on to your seats. Here's David Cay Johnston.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here, and I agree that, boy, what cafeteria. Not like anyone I went to. We've been having a very interesting and well-framed discussion today about a number of tax issues, but I want to, as is my nature, blow things up by suggesting that maybe we're all having the wrong debates about taxes in this country. Maybe we need to step back and think a little differently, because I think what's underneath, what is driving all of the discussions that we have, a lot of the scholarship that's done by people who presented excellent papers today and others, all derives from the Chicago School's emphasis and influence on American policy. And I went to the Chicago School. I'm not a graduate of it, but I went to it. I often call myself the leading apostate of the school, but if Richard Posner writes one more book like the last one, I'm going to have to stop saying that. So let me suggest that we need a couple of parameters and then walk through why I think we're having the wrong debate. Now, it was mentioned this morning what the income tax in America is really becoming. It's becoming a wage tax, and it's becoming a wage tax for everyone but executives and very, very high earners. Look where we start the top tax rate in this country. A two-income professional couple, a doctor married to a dentist, not a brain surgeon, but a pediatrician married to a dentist. They're on the cusp of the top 1%. And those people pay the same income tax as people in America who have an income as measured by the tax system of $1 million a day. There's something seriously wrong if you think that's a progressive system. Secondly, the real game, which Ed McCaffrey particularly talked about, and I try very hard when I talk to audiences who don't think about tax, ordinary Americans, to get them to understand this, is if you're wealthy enough, you don't have to pay taxes anymore in America. They're voluntary. And I've written enough pieces for Tax Notes, for Reuters when I worked for them, for the New York Times, in my books where I have named very wealthy Americans who we know from the public record do not pay income taxes. They've had to disclose it in a divorce proceeding or litigation or because they ran for public office. That it's easy to find people like that. I was shocked when Ed told us that it was only a $10 million threshold to get there, because the example I always start with is, well, imagine Uncle Harvey you never heard of left you $1 billion. But we have a problem with what we count as income under a system designed a century ago to a Congress who, when they discussed capital gains taxation, they had a meeting where their model for capital gains was the life cycle of a cow. Now, we also had a little bit of discussion about capital gains, estate taxes, and whether we should have an inheritance tax. I think that this idea that you can have gains that will never be taxed is very pernicious. It is what will lead to America becoming like 18th century France. And I presume you all recall how well that went. Dynasty trusts are part of that. Why was there a French Revolution? Because if you were born in the 1700s in France, your entire life's economics were determined by how well you picked your parents, your gender, and the order of your birth. And because all the property was tied up in these trusts controlled by the church and the aristocracy, and there was no opportunity, there was no recycling, there was no up and down. In America, we now have created a system where we allow American corporations to pile up unlimited amounts of untaxed profits. Even though we've had since 1909 a penalty tax for having more cash than you reasonably need to run your business, even though we have a mechanical test set by the tax court in the 1950s, Ronald Reagan signed a law that said, asterisk exemption, you can have unlimited amounts of cash offshore. The money could be right here, but as long as the account is titled offshore. Well, lo and behold, what's happened? We have these incredible piles of uncashed money that are very conservatively invested offshore because corporate executives are inherently managers who are risk averse. And if you doubt that, there's a study that came out last year showing that 72% of the money raised in initial public offerings in this country, in secondary public offerings in this country in the last decade was money not used to build a new factory or support research or expand the company, but for savings. Hoarding cash by executives, which is not at all what we want as an economy nor what people want to have as investors. We are seeing the rise, because of the rules we have and the way we are thinking about tax issues, of what Ed Kleinberg calls stateless income, and that Steve Bank, I'm sure, will talk about this afternoon. We are not discussing, when we talk about saving, that all savings is not alike. We are not discussing that all investment is not alike. We are not discussing how our tax laws encourage unproductive investment and discourage productive investment here in the U.S. Go buy yourself a boat that has a sleeping area, a kitchen, and a head, and you qualify for the mortgage interest deduction, provided you make enough money in order to qualify for it, which you probably do if you can afford to buy the boat. This makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I was at a wedding in Palm Beach in December, and my wife and I drove around and looked at the houses, and we came upon where all the yachts were, some of them over 100 feet long, and I looked at it and I said, that's not after-tax dollars. Those people aren't using their after-tax, I don't care how wealthy they are, those aren't after-tax dollars for these pleasure boats. This is evidence that the tax system is not doing what it's supposed to do. Now, we also talk a lot about tax expenditures, $1 trillion a year. And the fact is, most of those are for benefits to large numbers of people, but they tend to be like the housing subsidy, upside-down benefits, like the pension subsidy, like the 401k subsidy, upside-down benefits where people who make more get the benefit. I think we need to be talking in terms of taxes on what we spend our taxes on and what the purpose of taxes are. We need to change the debate to go back to some fundamental basics. In my neighborhood in Rochester, New York, we voted 6 years ago to raise our property taxes. And I live, according to the Tax Foundation, in the county with the highest property taxes in America. I pay over 4% of the annual value of my house in property taxes. On the other hand, housing in Rochester is so cheap, we call it an appreciating asset. By paying more taxes, I'm better off. Remember when George Bush used to say, I want you to have more money in your pocket, so I'm cutting your taxes? Well, in my neighborhood, for every additional dollar I pay in property taxes, for what we voted for, I have $1.80 more cash in my pocket. How did I do that? Because we went from a quote-unquote free market garbage collection system where every single day of the week a different stinky diesel truck came down the street, and every day when you drove down the street somebody had trash on the curb, to collectively buying that, using our joint buying power and competitive bidding, and now we have 1 day a week service and we pay about 40% of the price we used to pay. Paying higher taxes can often make you wealthier and better off. Nobody's talking about that in this country. I have given a talk just about this to audiences and had people shout out, "You're a liar." I had a young man in Wisconsin at a college I spoke to, a college student, who began badgering and arguing with me about this. And I said, well, why don't you hear the story of how we do this? He says, you're just lying. And he and his friends got up and they walked out. They would not listen because they had been indoctrinated in this idea. Tax has become the most vile four-letter word in America. Now, if we were to talk about how we spend our tax dollars, I think we'd be having a very different debate. We do not have in America universal health care, despite what Dr. Braun, the congressman from Texas says, or from Georgia says. He says, everybody has health care, you just go to the emergency room. Right, a great place to get treatment for heart disease, diabetes, all sorts of chronic illnesses. For every dollar on a purchasing power parity basis that the other 33 modern economies in the world spend on universal health care, Americans spend $2.64. $1 to $2.64. It's $8,200 a year in this country, $3,100 on average in the other 33. Portugal, a country with significantly less than half the income of the US in purchasing parity dollars, per capita income. Portugal has universal health care. How can they afford universal health care if we can't afford it? In fact, how can we not afford to have universal health care? Because we don't have universal health care, we take people who are productive taxpayers and turn them into tax eaters when they become prematurely disabled and unable to work. 45,000 people a year, including people I've known, die because they don't have health insurance. I know 3 women in my life who all died from treatable breast cancers. They didn't have the most aggressive breast cancers, but under our government's policy, you get health care if you have cancer when you go to stage 3 and become totally disabled. And at that point, your chances of survival are down very significantly, and all 3 of these women died. It is immoral to do what we're doing. I own with 2 of my 8 children a little business. It's a tiny business. It's less than $2 million a year. When we started this business, had to spend a number of evenings trying to figure out how to buy health care. It is none of my business who my employees sleep with, what religion, if any, they believe in, what color car they drive, what furniture they have, who they vote for. But it's my business whether they might have a heart attack, a chronic illness. And why do I have to divert time from the business we want to be running to deal with health care? If this business was in Hungary or Canada or the Netherlands or Australia, I wouldn't spend 1 second thinking about this. And a friend of mine in Rochester, I have the oddity, because housing is so cheap, of having a number of people in my neighborhood who are quite wealthy. A few of them own their own jets. One of my neighbors, a man who has owned 33 different businesses and employs thousands of people, was explaining to me one day how the healthcare system is really, in his view, a subsidy system for the very biggest corporations, some of which he competes against in certain markets. But a penalty system for guys like him because, well, he has thousands of people working for him in all these different companies. They're not big enough to pay market rates. They pay premium rates for their health insurance. It's an institutionalized disadvantage. So maybe we need to have not just critical race theory, which you heard from Dorothy Brown about today, but critical corporate theory in the same way. Look at the money we spend on national security. not just the Defense Department, but the whole national security budget. All the income taxes that will be collected from January 1st of this year until sometime in March of next year will be needed to pay for 1 year's national security operation. Did you know you pay for 71 nuclear submarines? Against whom? We're going to use a nuke against a bunch of crazies who are stateless, like Al-Qaeda? You can take out a whole city because there's a small group of people who've done something? No. And that's money largely that we drain out of the country to support a huge standing army in Europe, to support a military doctrine that is older than I am, that says we have to be prepared to fight 2 land wars, one in Asia and one in Europe simultaneously, full-scale wars, with absolutely no indication that that's likely to happen. If we simply brought down our healthcare costs, our federal government's budget would balance in a couple of years. That's all we have to do. And we don't have to bring them down to the average of those 33 countries. We only have to bring it down to the average of the country with the best healthcare system in the world, France, where there's no out-of-pocket charge when you go to the doctor, and people have better life expectancies than we do. If we brought down our national security budget, which is now 44% just on the straight military side, not the CIA, the NSA, the bomb-making division of the Pentagon, Veterans Affairs, just the Pentagon. 44% of all the money in the world. If we brought that down, we could almost balance the budget just on that. We are running a system that is not focused on the future. We are running a system in which we think we're still living in the 1930s and the 1950s and the 1980s instead of in the 21st century. Part of the reason for this is the way we talk about redistribution. We look at redistribution as a snapshot. Think about how the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post and all sorts of graphics you see on TV talk about redistribution. It's a snapshot of what's going on today. I think that's totally wrong. And there's a Canadian study that I reanalyzed for Tax Notes, that ran in Tax Notes International, and I think it's on the blog page that has been restored now that I've gone back to work there, about a study done in Canada of who benefits from public taxes, how the public benefits. And what it showed is there's actually pretty mild redistribution. Even in Canada, once you recognize that you have some people you're going to have to take care of. Not everybody is going to be able to work, be successful. Some people get sick. Some people are the victims of unfortunate accidents. Some people do stupid things. But you're going to have costs you're going to have to bear. Here's how I think we should think about redistribution. We should go back to what Congress was doing in 1913, or when the actual debate occurred in 1909, with the life cycle of the cow. And we should think about life cycles. When you're born, you get subsidized. You get public health, vaccines, clean water, parks, education. Then you go to work. Some people make a lot of money, some people make a little money, and a lot of people have jobs that make wealth creation possible. Don't have nurses and librarians and police officers and clerks. You can't have wealth creation. You have to have systems that enable wealth creation. All private wealth is built on a foundation of commonwealth. Then, after you've done work, or until you can't work, you get benefits again. You get old age income, you get health care. Now, if we started thinking about redistribution in terms of that, in terms of life cycles, and we started saying, well, we need to collect the right data to do this so that we understand that, I think we could change the tax debate. And all of a sudden, the idea of a goods and services tax or a value-added tax or other taxes that are seen as regressive would instead be seen like the property tax we voted to raise in my neighborhood as simply collective buying mechanisms that create the greatest benefit at the lowest cost. But that requires changing the debate we're having and thinking differently about how we approach these issues. We need to think about other ways of approaching things, and one of them I'm very enamored of is the Canadians address this problem of step-up in basis. I mean, the talks we heard this morning in the gift and tax panel are exactly right. I'm sorry, you can leave $10 million with a step-up in basis, all gain, and it will never be taxed. That's an enormous amount of money. I'm not talking about amounts that are so small or trivial we don't care. And by the way, lots of people die in this country with negative net worths. My dad was a 100% disabled veteran, so that when my mother and my father died, it cost me money. I didn't inherit anything. It cost me money. When my brother dies, he's a manual laborer who's now disabled. It'll cost me money. We need to recognize that there are other ways to approach this. An inheritance tax, after all, the amendment to the Constitution says income from any source derived. I don't know why it can't be an income from an inheritance. Yes, there are some administrative problems, but compared to the estate tax, we need to come up with different statistical tools. One of the most troubling things going on in our society is that as we are tightening up these budgets and saying, oh, we need less government, we are reducing all sorts of data collection by government. And government now, in many cases, relies on the industries it regulates. That's one of the key things in my book, The Fine Print, that I tell about. The industries that are being regulated provide the information to the regulators. So we don't just have something called regulatory capture, where the regulated have a focused interest and capture the agency. We now have regulatory blindness. And we're increasingly seeing an important trend in tax, and that is the diversion of tax dollars from public purposes to private gain. Now, you saw the series the New York Times did on corporate gifts. It is vastly worse than the Times story described. The Times missed, among other things, a $5 billion gift to Alcoa, a $1.4 billion gift to the hereditary ruler of Abu Dhabi, an almost $1 billion gift to Boeing, a $450 million gift to Volkswagen, a $1 billion gift to ThyssenKrupp. I could go on here for another 5 or 6 minutes. 2,700 big companies, every big brand name company that you know about, now has a deal in one of 20 states or more to keep the state income taxes withheld from their workers' paychecks. Let me say that again because it's really hard to believe that. Workers, hundreds of thousands of workers at 2,700 companies in 20 states have state income taxes withheld from their checks that never go to the state government. They are kept by the company they work for. They are being taxed by their boss. Billions and billions and billions of dollars are being taken out of people's pockets and given to corporations through all sorts of mechanisms. A host of them, most of which the news media has never written about. That's why I wrote the book, The Fine Print, was to expose a whole bunch of these. We now have rules that say that one industry that is exempt from the corporate income tax, the pipeline industry, can collect the corporate income tax and its rates and keep the money. Now, it's about 3 cents per American per day. Nobody's going to go to war over 3 cents a day. But if you can get 3 cents a day from everybody in America, at the end of the year, you've got $3.3 billion. And your net ultimate cash in your pocket after all the taxes as a result of this goes up somewhere between, depending on the gross up and the tax rate of where the state is, between 64 and 75%. I think we need to be talking about taxes exist to make society work. We are social animals. We need taxes to provide for the 6 noble purposes in our Constitution: to establish justice, to promote to promote domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, create a more perfect union, though we pretty well took care of that, at least in a big way, when we got the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. To provide for the general welfare, and by the way, the W in the original is a capital, and preserve our liberties for ourselves and future generations. That's why we need taxes, and we need to be talking about taxes for those purposes. How do we promote the general welfare through our taxes? How does it benefit the general welfare that Warren Buffett has a $2/3 billion interest-free loan from the federal government, only half of which is due 34 years from now. How does that benefit us? How does allowing people to borrow against untaxed appreciated assets, assets whose growth is unrecognized by the tax system, and live off that money, and therefore live tax-free, promote the general welfare? So I would suggest that the time has come that we should start backing away from looking at this the way the Chicago school has successfully gotten us to all think about these issues. And part of the reason it's time to do it is people like Dan Ariely and a lot of other behavioral economists are bit by bit showing that the Chicago school stuff doesn't work. It is unbelievably elegant on paper, it just doesn't work in the real world. We need to recognize that we want a system where we reward people who play by the rules and who are prudent. We need to get that word, prudent, back into our lexicon. We need to ask ourselves why it is that fiduciary has become such a terrible word. I have been married for, what's the date, 19th? Yeah, I have been married for 30 years, 7 months, and 19 days to a fiduciary. And I asked her one day, I came home and I said, is there something I'm missing? I just was at a thing in New York and it was about how terrible it is to have fiduciary status posed upon you. Are we being hurt somehow? And she said, no. I said, well, how would it matter? And she says, well, it's a terrible thing to be a fiduciary if now and then you want to cheat people. But as long as you don't want to cheat, it doesn't matter. That's really what that means. If you're honest and you follow the rules and you behave, you shouldn't be afraid of being a fiduciary. But we're taking away accountability and responsibility. And the tax debate we should be having is about how do we get accountability, responsibility, the most benefit for our taxes. How do we get taxes that grow the economy, that encourage productive investment rather than unproductive investment, that eliminate wasteful practices like our sick care non-system system, that enable businesses to flourish by focusing on running their businesses, not healthcare, that address the institutionalized inequities in our system that particularly Dorothy talked about this morning. That's the debate we should be having, and I would encourage all of you to, as you're doing your scholarship, or if you're a practitioner in your work, to just step back and white paper things and say to yourself, okay, what's really going on here in the work that I'm looking at, and should we think about this in another way in order that we will make sure that this nation endures? So, thank you.